The realization slowly dawned that, according to John Ramsey's account, at least one of the intruders must have remained hiding in the home well after the time the police arrived on the scene to investigate the kidnapping of his daughter. That brought me to a halt, and I struggled to recall the sequence of people's visits to the basement that morning, which is where intruder theorists indicated the suspect or suspects had entered the home. There were 4 people who had been through the basement that morning, included 2 police officers, Fleet White and John Ramsey. The condition of that train room led me to believe, based on the statements, that someone had remained in the home long after police arrived that morning. So the question was for me, how the heck did they get out with all those people there in the house that morning?
The realization hit slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the cold seep of winter air through a cracked window. But once it sank in, it refused to leave. According to John Ramsey, at least one of the intruders, the person or persons who had invaded their home in the dead of night, must have remained hidden somewhere inside the house long after the police had arrived that fateful morning. It was a thought that seemed impossible, almost absurd, and yet, somehow, it felt undeniably true. How could someone possibly stay hidden in a house that was, by all appearances, crawling with eyes, both official and familial? The house that was supposed to be safe, familiar, and impervious to the nightmares of the outside world? I struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events, replaying it over and over in my mind, each replay revealing cracks, inconsistencies, shadows that seemed darker than mere absence of light. The basement alone had been a theater of tension and motion that morning. 2 police officers moved with measured authority, each corner swept, each shadow interrogated for signs of life. Fleet White, a name etched into the early reports, was there, meticulously surveying every inch, notebook in hand. John Ramsey, father and protector, moved through the space with a mixture of fear and determination, his every gesture weighted with urgency. And yet, despite their combined vigilance, for individuals present, eyes everywhere, the intruder or intruders had somehow remained invisible, a ghost among the living, navigating the home with a confidence that was chilling to contemplate. I paused, letting the question settle in my mind. How could a human being remain unseen in a home filled with moving bodies, with doors opening, floors creaking, voices calling out? Every step in that house should have betrayed them. Every corner turned, every drawer opened, every whisper of a footstep across the floor should have been a signal that someone was there. And yet, somehow, someone, or more than one, remained hidden, watching, waiting, untouched by the chaos and urgency that surrounded them. The very thought sent a shiver down my spine. It was in that moment I began to grasp the profound horror of that morning. The police were there, methodically attempting to piece together what had happened in the hours before their arrival. But their presence, intended as a shield of order and safety, seemed almost irrelevant against the cunning and audacity of the intruder. Somewhere, perhaps just beyond the edges of vision, a person was lying in wait, unaffected by the authority that filled the rooms. The mind struggles to imagine it, to reconcile the normalcy of a domestic space, a house filled with laughter, family routines, and light, with the sinister shadow of someone lurking unseen. I tried to recall the exact timeline of visitors and movements within the basement that morning, each detail a thread in a tapestry that refused to fit together neatly. The officers, Fleet White and John Ramsey, moved with purpose. The other 2 individuals, whose names may not be widely known, but whose presence was documented in the early reports, added to the visual and auditory chaos that should have made detection inevitable. And yet, the intruder remained, a phantom navigating the edges of awareness. Was it cunning? Or a terrifying combination of both? Each possibility seemed equally plausible, and each equally horrifying. There was something profoundly disorienting about the idea that someone could exist within the house unnoticed. A normal human mind struggles to conceive of this. Homes are designed for visibility, for shared experience, for communal living. Even in moments of distraction, we are aware of movement, of sound, of presence. But in the Ramsey household that morning, the rules of perception seemed to bend. The intruder moved as though the house itself conspired in their concealment, exploiting shadows, corners, and the natural distractions of human activity. To imagine it is to feel a primal unease, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise and refuses to allow comfort even in the daylight. As I continued to replay the events, I realized the complexity of the human dynamics involved. John Ramsey, protective yet understandably overwhelmed, was focused on the immediate, tangible signs of what had happened. He was responding to crisis, attempting to regain control, to rescue what had been lost. The police, trained and methodical, were attempting to assert order, to gather evidence, to follow protocol. But neither could account for the unseen presence, the interloper who had slipped beneath the notice of every person in the house. It was a terrifying reminder of how even in situations of extreme vigilance, humans are fallible, blind to what lies in the shadows. The house itself seemed almost complicit, a stage on which the drama of the morning unfolded. The basement, with its low ceilings, shadowed corners, and the hum of unseen appliances, became a labyrinth of concealment. Doors, cupboards, and storage spaces, each a potential hiding spot, transformed ordinary domesticity into a theater of suspense. The intruder's presence, undetected and silent, forced me to confront the terrifying possibility that in moments of crisis, safety is never guaranteed, that the very spaces we consider sanctuaries can be infiltrated without warning. I could not ignore the human element, the fear, the instinct, the desperate hope that must have coursed through the minds of everyone present. For the police, it was protocol and duty. For John Ramsey, it was love, terror, and the raw drive to protect his family. Yet, no matter their intent or diligence, the intruder remained unaccounted for, a shadow inhabiting the house in parallel to their reality. The cognitive dissonance of this situation, the coexistence of vigilance and invisibility, was nearly impossible to process. It was the kind of scenario that lodges in the mind, gnaws at rationality, and refuses closure. Every detail I considered deepened the unease. How long had the intruder stayed hidden? What had they observed in those crucial moments before, during, and after the police arrived? And most chillingly, what were their intentions? The unanswered questions multiplied, each one a spark igniting fear and curiosity in equal measure. The narrative of that morning could have been dramatically different. Every decision, every movement, every failure to detect the unseen presence potentially altering the outcome in ways we might never fully understand. Even now, thinking back to the scenario, it is almost impossible not to feel a creeping dread. The idea of someone hiding in plain sight, in a space filled with authority and protection, touches something primal in the human psyche. It challenges our assumptions about safety, about observation, about control. The intruder's audacity, or perhaps the terrifying alignment of circumstance that allowed them to remain hidden, transforms a domestic morning into a scene of psychological horror. It is a reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous threats are the ones we cannot see, the ones that occupy the peripheries of our awareness, patiently waiting while life continues around them. As I reconstructed the sequence of events over and over, I kept returning to the same haunting question. Who was still in the house, moving unseen, watching and listening while the rest of the world assumed the crisis was under control? The notion defied logic and reason. And yet, in the cold, stark reality of what was reported, it seemed undeniable. It is this intersection of human oversight, clever concealment, and chaotic circumstance that defines the enduring mystery of that morning. It is the part of the story that chills, that grips, and that refuses to be untangled, leaving us to wonder if we can ever truly know the full truth of what transpired behind closed doors in the Ramsey household. In the end, the most unsettling realization is not only that someone may have remained hidden, but that the ordinary structures of vigilance, authority, and protection, police officers, family presence, procedural diligence, proved, in that moment, insufficient. It is a sobering reminder of the fragility of safety, of the unforeseen forces that can operate in the spaces we consider secure. That morning, the Ramsey house became a labyrinth of tension and uncertainty, and somewhere within its walls, an unseen presence lingered, a reminder that even in moments of clarity and action, the unknown can still thrive, silent, invisible, and profoundly unnerving. The condition of that train room suggested something deeply unsettling, something almost impossible to comprehend. It was as if the room itself had absorbed the tension, the fear, and the quiet horror of a presence that had lingered, undetected, in the most ordinary of spaces. Every overturned chair, every scattered toy, every subtle imperfection whispered a sinister possibility. Someone had been there, moving silently, hiding in plain sight, observing the chaos unfold without leaving a trace. The very air seemed heavy with the memory of that hidden presence, a shadow that had evaded scrutiny even as the adults moved through the space with urgency and authority. It has been nearly 3 decades since 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was discovered lifeless in the basement of her family home in Boulder, Colorado. A home that should have been a sanctuary, a space of laughter, comfort, and familial security. Instead, it became the stage for a nightmare so meticulously orchestrated that it continues to haunt investigators, journalists, and the public alike. The crime scene was carefully, almost obsessively, arranged, each detail deliberately designed to mislead, to confuse, and to distract from the real truth lurking somewhere just beyond sight. Investigators, seasoned and meticulous, chased shadows and red herrings, grappling with contradictions, hidden motives, and a labyrinth of potential suspects. Yet, despite their expertise, the true answer remained frustratingly, maddeningly close, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone perceptive enough to see it. Walking through the scene, even in retrospective accounts and photographs, it is impossible not to feel the oppressive tension of that moment. The basement, with its dim lighting, low ceilings, and nooks that seemed perfect for concealment, becomes almost a character itself in this story, a silent witness to a crime that defied comprehension. The so-called train room, with its innocent toys and domestic normality, transforms into a sinister tableau, a place where innocence collided violently with something unthinkably dark. Every object, every detail, seems to hint at an intruder's lingering presence, a careful choreography meant to confuse the eye and to obscure the truth. What makes the JonBenét Ramsey case so endlessly compelling, and so tragically frustrating, is precisely this duality. The apparent simplicity of a suburban home, familiar and safe, contrasted with the profound complexity of a crime staged with calculated precision. For decades, theories have swirled around the question of who could orchestrate such a crime, who could manipulate a scene so that the real answers remained invisible even to those charged with uncovering them. And yet, for all the speculation, all the investigative hours poured over floor plans, photographs, and witness statements, the central question remains unchanged. How could someone remain hidden, undetected, in a home teeming with movement, observation, and scrutiny? The answer, of course, is what haunts us most. It is not only the idea of a crime executed with terrifying skill, but the terrifying possibility that those who searched so diligently may have been looking in the wrong direction entirely. The shadows, the false trails, the staged evidence, all of it served to mislead, to focus attention elsewhere, while the truth existed quietly, almost invisibly, within the very space that had been scoured. It is a reminder that in the most familiar places, the places we believe to be safe, the unknown can still thrive. A child's room, a basement, a simple train set, all can become part of a narrative of concealment, of deception, of horror hidden in the most mundane details. Even now, nearly 30 years later, the case retains an almost magnetic hold on public consciousness. Every new interview, every retrospective analysis, every documentary revisit uncovers layers previously unseen, as though the story itself resists finality. The house in Boulder is no longer merely a physical location. It has become a symbol of unanswered questions, a repository for fear, confusion, and the persistent hope that someday, the truth might finally emerge from the shadows. That train room, innocent in appearance but ominous in retrospect, represents more than a single crime. It is a testament to the fragility of perception, to the cleverness of concealment, and to the human struggle to discern reality from illusion in moments of unspeakable tragedy. Ultimately, the JonBenét Ramsey case is defined by that tension between visibility and invisibility, between the obvious and the hidden. The train room, the basement, the staged scene, They remind us that evil can occupy the spaces we least expect, that secrets can hide in plain sight, and that the answers we seek may lie not in the chaos we see, but in the subtle, overlooked details that whisper the truth to those willing to listen. In every shadow, in every silent corner, in every overlooked toy or misplaced object, the story of JonBenét's final moments continues to beckon, demanding attention and refusing closure. Even after decades, we are left to confront the chilling reality. The crime scene, meticulously staged and hauntingly quiet, holds its secrets with stubborn permanence. And somewhere, in that stillness, in the intersection of domestic normality and unimaginable horror, the lingering presence of a shadow, once hidden in plain sight, reminds us that the human capacity for concealment, cunning, and deception remains as unsettling as ever. At precisely 5:52 a.m., the calm of a Colorado morning was shattered by a phone call that would set off one of the most notorious investigations in American history. Patty Ramsey, mother of 6-year-old JonBenét, dialed 911. But almost immediately, something about her voice struck the trained dispatchers on the other end as unsettling, almost unnatural. There was a measured cadence to her words, a strange precision that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "We have a kidnapping," she said, deliberately referencing the ransom note before even naming her own daughter. The phrasing, the timing, the focus on the note rather than the immediate danger to JonBenét planted an uneasy seed in the minds of those listening. It was a call for help, yes, but it was delivered with a calmness, an almost eerie composure, that made the situation feel strangely detached from the urgency one would expect in a home gripped by terror. Even as panic coursed invisibly through the house, nothing appeared to spiral into chaos. Coffee was poured, breakfast remained on the table, rooms retained the staged perfection of daily life. It was as if the household itself had been frozen, performing a careful choreography while the world outside remained unaware of the nightmare that had already begun within. Every gesture, every movement, seemed designed to convey normalcy, to mask the grim reality lurking in the basement, just out of sight. In that early morning calm, a disturbing tension took hold. The line between reality and performance blurred. The 911 call, while outwardly a plea for help, also carried the undertone of a show, a meticulous presentation for the authorities, for anyone who might witness or hear of the events as they unfolded. It was a performance that would set the stage for decades of speculation, debate, and investigation. The house, the family, and the call itself became part of a narrative carefully constructed, whether consciously or unconsciously, one in which fear was measured, gestures were calculated, and the story was already beginning to be told. Dispatchers, trained to detect emotion, urgency, and distress, could not ignore the strange composure. Even in their own attempts to assess the situation, they were caught in a web of contradictions. The words conveyed danger, yet the tone suggested control. The details of the ransom note were shared with precision, yet the human reaction, panic, desperation, the raw emotional terror of a parent fearing for her child, was curiously absent. That tension, between the spoken and the unspoken, between what was visible and what lay beneath, would come to define the Ramsey case in the eyes of investigators and the public alike. In retrospect, it is almost impossible not to feel the chill of that moment. The house, the call, the coffee, the staged calm, they hint at something profoundly unsettling, that even in moments of extreme crisis, appearances can be deceiving. A domestic space, carefully maintained and controlled, had become a stage for performance, masking the terror, the tragedy, and the secrets hidden just beneath the surface. The 911 call was not just a report, it was the opening act of a drama that would unfold across decades, captivating the nation and leaving an indelible mark on the collective imagination. Every word Patty spoke, every pause and emphasis, seemed laden with intent. Whether conscious or unconscious, we cannot know. And yet, in that deliberate calm, in the quiet precision of the early morning, the performance had begun. Rooms would remain staged, gestures carefully controlled, and the story of JonBenét Ramsey's final hours would be told not only through evidence, but through the unsettling narrative woven in real time, one that would challenge investigators, journalists, and the public to question what is real, what is performed, and what lurks unseen in the shadows of a suburban home. Even as officers and detectives arrived at the scene, they were confronted with this eerie blend of normalcy and terror. Coffee cups, neatly arranged, and rooms that appeared untouched by the chaos implied an order that contrasted violently with the horror discovered in the basement. The stage was set, the players in place, and the performance, whether intentional, instinctual, or horrifyingly natural, was already underway. Every minute, every gesture, every carefully constructed detail would become fodder for speculation, for theory, for decades of questioning. How could a home so ordinary conceal such a nightmare? How could terror exist within such calm? It is in that dissonance, the tension between outward composure and inner chaos, that the JonBenét Ramsey case finds much of its lasting intrigue. The 911 call, far from being a simple emergency report, became a defining moment, a prism through which the entire tragedy would be viewed. And as that call echoed across the emergency networks of Boulder, Colorado, the first act of a real-life drama that would haunt the nation had begun, a tragedy staged in a suburban home, where fear was measured, appearances were maintained, and the chilling performance continued long after the first words were spoken. At 1:10 p.m., hours after the initial chaos had subsided, a family friend, a voice of insistence amid the lingering tension, urged John Ramsey to return to the basement. The suggestion was simple, almost casual, but in the air hung the weight of dread. The basement had already been scoured, scrutinized by police and family alike, yet something primal in that friend's urging suggested there was more to discover. John Ramsey descended the stairs with a chilling calm, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Every step was measured, each footfall careful, as though navigating not just the physical space of the basement, but the invisible labyrinth of fear and uncertainty that had grown there over the past hours. He bypassed boxes, beams, and furniture with a precision that seemed both practiced and eerie, his focus unwavering. The basement, already heavy with tension and the memory of the morning's events, seemed to constrict around him, the shadows deepening as he moved. And then, in a moment that would forever be etched into the nation's consciousness, he found her. JonBenét, his 6-year-old daughter, lay lifeless in the cold, dimly lit basement. Her body, bound in a manner that spoke of careful intent, seemed impossibly small and fragile against the stark concrete floor. Nearby rested a black maglite, its presence both ordinary and menacing, a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded. The sight was a collision of innocence and brutality, a moment so shocking that it defied comprehension. Detective Linda Arndt, who had been surveying the scene, felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise instinctively. She reached for her holster, her instincts screaming that the threat had not departed. The crime, brutal as it was, still felt alive, lingering in the air like a shadow that refused to dissipate. In her experience, such precision, such deliberate cruelty, suggested a killer who was not only cunning but intimately familiar with the space, a presence that could vanish into the home as easily as it had entered. And in truth, the chilling intuition proved nearly prophetic. The killer had never truly left. Every staged detail, every deliberate misdirection, every carefully placed object in the basement hinted at a mind that had orchestrated terror with meticulous calculation. The house, though filled with investigators and family members, remained a theater of concealment and control, with the unseen orchestrators still dominating the narrative from beyond the visible. In that tense moment, time seemed to stretch. The basement, once familiar and domestic, was now transformed into a chamber of horror, where shadows seemed to move of their own volition and the air was thick with unspoken menace. Each object, the maglite, the bindings, the furniture, told a story of control and forethought. The crime was not a spontaneous act of rage or opportunity. It was a performance, a carefully executed orchestration that left investigators grasping at fragments of understanding. John Ramsey's discovery forced everyone in the room to confront a terrifying reality. The danger, the calculated cruelty, the presence of the unseen had not been fully contained by the arrival of police, by the frantic activity of the morning, or by the careful procedures of investigation. The killer's shadow lingered still, invisible yet palpable, as if the basement itself retained the essence of the crime, a silent testimony to the horror inflicted within its walls. For Detective Arndt, for John Ramsey, and for all who were present, the moment was a stark reminder of how ordinary spaces can be invaded by extraordinary evil. The basement, once a place of storage and play, had been transformed into a grim stage where innocence was destroyed and the illusion of safety shattered. The lingering presence of the killer, a presence suggested not by movement but by the meticulous arrangement of the crime scene, ensured that the sense of menace would not leave the room, nor would it ever truly leave the minds of those who bore witness. That afternoon in Boulder, Colorado, the Ramsey household was forever altered. The discovery of JonBenét's lifeless body, bound and silent, punctuated by the ordinary, menacing presence of a mag light, crystallized the horror that had been slowly building all morning. It was a moment of confrontation with the unfathomable, the realization that evil could enter a home, remain hidden in plain sight, and leave a trail of meticulously staged devastation, all while the world continued as though nothing had happened. In those frozen seconds, with Detective Arndt's hand poised over her holster and John Ramsey frozen in shock, the truth became undeniable. The killer had not merely committed a crime, they had commanded the narrative, orchestrated the environment, and demonstrated a mastery of concealment that defied logic. The shadow of the intruder was no longer just a theory, it was a presence that had walked among them, invisible but potent, leaving a mark that would linger in the collective memory of a nation for decades to come. 2.5 pages. That's all it took to transform an ordinary suburban morning into a national tragedy that would haunt the public imagination for decades. The ransom note left in the Ramsey home was unlike anything ever encountered in a real-world kidnapping. Its sheer length and intricacy were staggering. Whereas most kidnappers left brief, hurried demands, this note read like a carefully rehearsed manifesto, painstakingly written, structured with precision, and intended to convey authority, control, and terror. Every line was deliberate, every word a calculated psychological weapon, designed not simply to demand money but to manipulate, mislead, and dominate the minds of those who would read it. The content of the note only heightened the unease. It referenced a foreign faction, invoking threats and consequences that seemed utterly disconnected from the quiet, tree-lined streets of Boulder, Colorado. It spoke in grandiose, almost theatrical language, threatening harm with a precision that bordered on absurd. And then there was the demand itself, exactly $118,000, no more, no less, the precise amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus for that year. The specificity of the figure suggested either an insider with intimate knowledge of the family's finances or a perpetrator who had orchestrated the demand with painstaking attention to detail. The amount was so exact, so personal, that it transformed the note from a simple criminal demand into a psychological instrument of terror, engineered to provoke panic while conveying control. Even the physical tools of the note, the pen, the paper, and the handwriting, pointed to something deeply unsettling. Forensic analysis confirmed that all materials had originated within the Ramsey home, traced directly to Patty Ramsey herself. The instruments of the crime, of the communication from an unseen abductor, had been drawn from the very environment meant to protect JonBenét. The note was no random demand, it was a performance. Every aspect of it, from the tone to the phrasing to the choice of writing instruments, was designed to misdirect, to divert attention away from the truth, and to create a narrative of fear and confusion that would dominate the investigation. Yet while the note manipulated perception, the DNA evidence demanded clarity and delivered none. Male DNA was discovered on JonBenét's clothing, a critical lead that could have unlocked the mystery. But when compared against family members and criminal databases, the DNA matched no one. It suggested the presence of an entirely unknown individual, someone who had been in intimate contact with JonBenét yet remained invisible in the system. What should have been a breakthrough became an enigma, a haunting reminder that the crime had been committed with meticulous precision and that the perpetrator, or perpetrators, had left behind both clues and shadows that refused to align. Years later, in 2008, the DNA evidence was retested using more advanced techniques, revealing multiple unknown contributors. Rather than simplifying the case, this retest compounded the mystery. The very evidence meant to clarify only deepened the questions. How many people were involved? Were these traces remnants of the killer or unrelated contamination? Each new discovery, each new revelation, did not illuminate the truth. It added layers to a puzzle that seemed deliberately constructed to resist resolution. Every detail of the ransom note and DNA evidence pointed to a disturbing conclusion. This was not a spontaneous act, nor a simple kidnapping. It was an orchestrated performance. The note's specificity, the choice of materials, and the precision of its language indicated careful planning. The DNA suggested an unseen presence, someone whose identity remained beyond reach. Together, they wove a tapestry of deception and misdirection so intricate that even the most seasoned investigators were ensnared, chasing leads that seemed tangible but always slipped just out of grasp. The note and the DNA evidence do more than confuse, they haunt. They suggest the presence of a mind capable of crafting terror with surgical precision, someone who understood not only the act itself but the psychological landscape it would create. Every word written, every binding placed, every trace left behind was part of a deliberate design to control perception, manipulate the investigation, and leave the world grasping at shadows while the truth remained hidden. Even now, decades later, the Ramsey case is defined by this unsettling interplay between evidence and deception. The 2.5-page note, the male DNA, the retests, the unknown contributors, they form a narrative in which clarity remains elusive, where every answer seems to generate new questions. They remind us that in certain crimes, the performance is as important as the act itself, and that evil can linger, meticulously staged in plain sight. The stage was set. The performance had begun. And the truth, hidden in the carefully orchestrated chaos, continues to evade us, waiting silently, as inscrutable as the shadow of the person who crafted it all. James Kohler, a veteran investigator with decades of experience in unraveling the most complex and confounding cases, approached the Ramsey files with a methodical, almost obsessive precision. He combed through over 60,000 pages of reports, examining each line, each statement, each minutiae of testimony, as if the truth itself were hidden in the white space between the words. Every page was a potential clue, every call log a thread that could lead him closer to the answer that had eluded the world for decades. Frame by frame, detail by detail, Kohler sifted through the evidence with a relentless focus. Witness interviews were scrutinized, timelines reconstructed, and small contradictions that might have seemed inconsequential to others were elevated to critical pieces of the puzzle. The forensic photos, the police notes, the ransom note itself, he examined everything with a meticulous eye, looking for patterns, for subtle inconsistencies, for the faintest sign of a presence that might have been overlooked. And then, as he pored over the mountain of data, Kohler began to see what no one else had noticed. The connections that were invisible to the original investigators, the links that had been dismissed as coincidence or anomaly, started to form a pattern, like pieces of a jigsaw finally revealing the image hidden beneath the chaos. Small details that had been buried in 60,000 pages of bureaucratic notation and conflicting testimonies began to speak, almost whisper, telling a story that had been obscured by noise, oversight, and perhaps deliberate misdirection. It was a revelation that carried both exhilaration and dread. The case, long considered unsolvable by many, suddenly seemed to contain threads that could be followed, paths that led not just to questions, but potentially toward answers. Kohler's exhaustive work revealed patterns in timing, in movement, in behavior that suggested a level of planning, a choreography, that had been invisible in the initial whirlwind of investigation. What he saw wasn't obvious. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something that leapt off the page. It was subtle, quiet, yet profoundly telling. For Kohler, this painstaking process was both a professional challenge and a personal journey. He knew the stakes, not just for the reputation of the investigation, but for JonBenét herself, for a family still grieving, and for a public desperate for closure. Each revelation, each subtle link, was a reminder of the meticulous mind behind the crime, a presence that had eluded detection while manipulating the narrative from the shadows. By the time Kohler finished his review, he had pieced together a vision of the crime that was both clearer and more disturbing than anything previously seen. He saw the hidden choreography, the careful orchestration, the lingering presence of someone who had walked among the chaos unnoticed. And in that realization lay the haunting truth. The case was far more intricate, far more deliberate, than anyone had imagined, and the story that had captivated a nation was still only partially told. A broken basement window, a detail that at first glance seemed to scream intrusion, quickly revealed itself as one of the most confounding pieces of the puzzle. To the casual observer, it fit the narrative perfectly. A shadowy figure, a desperate intruder, climbing through the glass under cover of darkness to commit a crime so terrible that it would shock a nation. It was a story the mind readily accepted, because it was simple, tangible, and frightening. But the closer investigators looked, the more that initial impression unraveled like fraying thread. The spiderwebs in the corners of the frame remained undisturbed, delicate filaments that had stood for weeks, perhaps months, untouched and perfect. Any intruder attempting entry through the window would have shattered that fragile lacework, leaving behind a trace as certain as footprints in snow. Beneath the sill, pine needles lay precisely where they had fallen, each one a silent witness to the absence of movement. And there were no footprints, no impressions in the soft earth or the dusty floor of the basement beneath. No other signs suggested that someone had forced their way inside. Every detail pointed not to a break-in, but to a meticulous performance. The broken window, in other words, was not an entry point. It was a prop. A deliberate illusion meant to misdirect, to shape perception, to tell a story that suited someone else's narrative. It suggested violence from an outsider, a crime committed by a stranger slipping silently into the home. But the truth told a different, far more chilling story. The act had occurred within a house already intimately known, a home navigated by someone familiar with its every corner, every routine, every hidden nook. The evidence itself became a message. Nothing about this crime could be taken at face value. The ordinary had been transformed into theater, every detail a brushstroke painting a false narrative. Even decades later, the broken window remains emblematic of the JonBenét Ramsey case, a symbol of the deliberate staging, the misdirection, and the profound manipulation of reality. It reminds investigators, journalists, and the public alike that appearances were never to be trusted. The glass, the spiderwebs, the pine needles, they were not random. They were curated, each element carefully designed to reinforce the illusion of a forced entry, to distract from the real truth hiding elsewhere. The broken window was not evidence of an intruder. It was evidence of planning, of a mind capable of orchestrating not just a crime, but an enduring narrative that would baffle and manipulate for decades. The psychological impact of that stage detail cannot be understated. When officers first arrived, their eyes were drawn to the broken glass, their instincts telling them to search outward, to look for an external threat. And in that moment, the window achieved its purpose. It dictated behavior, guided perception, and framed the entire investigation in the direction the perpetrator intended. The home itself, once a place of safety, became a stage where terror was choreographed with almost surgical precision. Every object, every subtle detail, reinforced the idea that this was the work of an intruder lurking in the night, when in reality, the most terrifying presence was the one already inside the home. Even the mundane details, fallen glass, a shifted curtain, a slightly open window, took on sinister significance under the lens of the staged performance. They were props, instruments of misdirection, tools in a psychological strategy designed to keep truth just out of reach. The broken window is a haunting reminder that in this case, nothing could be taken at face value. Every detail, every piece of the environment, was manipulated. Every clue was curated. And behind it all was a mind so meticulous, so precise, that it could command perception itself, leaving investigators, family, and a nation perpetually chasing shadows. In the Ramsey home, the broken basement window remains a silent witness, not to an intruder climbing inside, but to a crime that had been executed with an almost theatrical mastery of deception. It stands as a chilling testament to the lengths someone went to control not just the act itself, but the very way the world would perceive it. And in that lingering presence, the suggestion of intrusion, the absence of footprints, the unbroken webs, lies one of the enduring lessons of the case. Evil can be staged, terror can be choreographed, and truth can hide in plain sight, just beyond reach, waiting silently for the eyes patient enough to see it. The black mag light, resting innocuously near JonBenét's lifeless form, would soon reveal itself as far more than a simple household flashlight. At first glance, it seemed almost mundane, a familiar object that belonged in the basement, a tool for illumination rather than destruction. But the forensic reality was far darker. When investigators examined the precise nature of JonBenét's injuries, the maglight's role became unmistakable. Her skull fracture, an 8.5-inch linear break with sharply beveled edges, matched the rim of the flashlight with horrifying accuracy. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative explanations. This was neither the result of a fall, nor an accident involving furniture, nor the impact of a bat. The maglight alone had inflicted the trauma that ended the life of a 6-year-old girl. The precision of the injury was chilling. Each detail, the length of the fracture, the way the edges sloped, the depth of the indentation, was consistent with the dimensions of the flashlight, as if the weapon had been designed for this very act. It was a crime executed with surgical specificity, transforming an ordinary object into an instrument of lethal intent. The implications were staggering. Whoever wielded it had the knowledge, strength, and intent to cause fatal injury, and then left the object deliberately within reach, as if to mock the investigators who would later discover it. The maglight's placement was equally telling. It was not tossed aside in haste. It lay nearby, almost casually, suggesting an awareness of the crime scene's subsequent scrutiny. The perpetrator had staged a tableau, creating a visual story that could mislead, confuse, and manipulate perception. To anyone unfamiliar with the forensic details, it might have appeared incidental, even innocuous. But in truth, it was a calculated detail, a prop in a carefully orchestrated performance, signaling both the precision of the attack and the deliberate effort to control the narrative of discovery. As forensic experts examined the fracture and its correlation to the flashlight, the horror deepened. The act itself had been carried out with knowledge and deliberation. It was not impulsive, it was methodical. Each motion, each swing, had been executed with a chilling understanding of cause and effect, of how force would translate into fatal injury. In that moment, the maglight transcended its ordinary function, becoming a symbol of calculated cruelty, a tangible link between the perpetrator and the life they had extinguished. The psychological implications were just as profound. This was not only a murder, it was a message. By using a common object, leaving it in plain sight, and ensuring it could be connected directly to the fatal injury, the perpetrator blurred the lines between everyday life and unimaginable violence. It was a stark reminder that danger can hide within the ordinary, that objects meant for safety or utility can be repurposed to deadly effect. The maglight was silent, yet it spoke volumes. It was both the instrument of death and a witness to the meticulous orchestration of the crime. Even decades later, the image of that flashlight lying near JonBenét's body remains seared into public memory. Its dark, cylindrical form is more than a household item. It is a symbol of the cold, calculated precision of the crime, a reminder that innocence was destroyed with deliberate intent. In the quiet, shadowed corners of that basement, the maglight stands as an enduring testament to the meticulous orchestration, the premeditation, and the chilling clarity of a single fatal act executed with terrifying precision. The truth it reveals is undeniable. JonBenét Ramsey did not die by accident. She was killed, and the maglight was the weapon that delivered the final, fatal blow, leaving a legacy of horror that would linger for generations. Autopsy records revealed a detail that might have seemed inconsequential to an outsider, yet in the Ramsey case, nothing was ever truly ordinary. Partially digested pineapple was found in JonBenét's stomach, a small, seemingly mundane fragment of her last hours. But in a home where every action, every movement, every object could carry weight, this tiny morsel became a crucial piece of the puzzle. The timing, the presence, the implications, it all demanded scrutiny. How had it been eaten? When had she eaten it? Was it part of dinner, a late-night snack, or something consumed in secret? Each question opened a corridor into the murky reality of that night, corridors investigators would navigate for decades without clear illumination. Complicating matters further were the fingerprints found on the bowl itself. Not the fingerprints of an unknown intruder, nor a stranger who had supposedly entered the house to commit a crime, but the fingerprints of those closest to JonBenét, her older brother, Burke, and her mother, Patty Ramsey. Both denied that she had eaten so late, insisting that the family's evening routine had been observed, that bedtime had been adhered to, that nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet the scientific record told a different story, a child's secret, minute but undeniable, buried in plain sight within the very house where the tragedy unfolded. It was an act unobserved, a moment invisible to the adults who believed they were overseeing her, preserved only by the cold, impartial eyes of forensic science. The partially digested pineapple carried implications far beyond its sweetness. It suggested a timeline that contradicted the statements of those closest to JonBenét. It indicated activity late into the evening, a deviation from the family's purported routine. It raised haunting questions. Had she been left unsupervised at a critical time? Had she moved through the house in ways no adult noticed? Or did the pineapple hint at a truth someone deliberately sought to obscure? Every bite became a symbol of mystery, a trace of autonomy that clashed with the staged chaos surrounding the case. The psychological resonance of this small clue cannot be overstated. A child's final actions, recorded not by witnesses but by science, revealed an independence that was invisible to those who claimed to know her routines. It suggested her last hours were punctuated by choices as ordinary as eating, that nonetheless held profound forensic significance. In the stark, clinical environment of the morgue, in the methodical documentation of digestion and chemical traces, this fragment of fruit became a silent testament to a life abruptly ended and a truth painstakingly obscured. Moreover, the pineapple exemplified the tension between appearance and reality that defined the Ramsey investigation. While the world was focused on the macabre spectacle of the crime scene, the staged windows, and the ransom note, small, overlooked details like this quietly held the potential to reshape timelines, challenge alibis, and illuminate the unseen movements of a child navigating a house that would ultimately become her final stage. In the grand theater of misdirection, the pineapple was a whisper of reality, subtle yet piercing, a reminder that sometimes the most revealing clues are the ones everyone assumes are trivial. Ultimately, the partially digested pineapple, coupled with the fingerprints on its bowl, became more than a forensic footnote. It was a window into the hidden layers of that night, a glimpse at autonomy, secrecy, and contradiction all coexisting within a tragedy dominated by deliberate staging. In a home filled with adults, under the eyes of caretakers and investigators alike, it revealed that not everything could be controlled, not everything could be anticipated, and that the tiniest, most overlooked details could hold the weight of truth. Even decades later, it remains a haunting testament to the subtle traces of a child's final hours, buried in plain sight, waiting silently for the world to notice. Burke Ramsey's childhood had been marked by incidents that, at first glance, seemed almost juvenile, the kind of mischief many children outgrow. Yet, when examined in isolation, these behaviors carried subtle warnings, clues that were largely dismissed at the time. There were reports of smearing feces, acts of aggression such as striking peers or younger children, and other patterns of disruptive or concerning behavior. In a typical household, these might have been chalked up to tantrums, attention-seeking, or sibling rivalry. But in retrospect, and under the scrutiny of a meticulous investigator like James Kohler, a different picture began to emerge. Kohler's re-examination of Burke's early years revealed a continuum of behavioral distress that had gone largely ignored by those around him. Each incident, when placed within the larger context of the Ramsey household, hinted at an underlying pattern, a mixture of impulsivity, boundary testing, and perhaps deeper psychological stressors that had never been fully addressed. While no one could have predicted tragedy from these acts alone, they became threads in a complex tapestry of family dynamics and latent tensions. What made these behaviors particularly striking was how consistently they appeared across multiple settings and observers. Reports from school, caregivers, and family accounts all suggested moments of troubling behavior, Unexplained outbursts, instances of cruelty, and actions that went beyond the expected scope of ordinary mischief. Taken individually, they might seem minor, easily dismissed as typical childhood antics. Taken together, however, and viewed through Kohler's lens, they suggested a child whose inner world was volatile, whose impulses sometimes spilled into actions that demanded attention. Kohler's investigation highlighted how these overlooked patterns could shape understanding of the household environment and the relationships within it. By mapping Burke's early behavior, he began to see the subtle dynamics of power, control, and attention in the Ramsey home. Dynamics that could influence not only interactions among family members but also the interpretation of events on that fateful night. What had once been catalogued as isolated incidents now appeared as interconnected signals, pieces of a puzzle that had been ignored or minimized for decades. The psychological weight of this re-examination cannot be overstated. It was not about assigning blame, but about understanding context, understanding that childhood actions, however small or bizarre, often reveal emotional patterns and coping mechanisms. In the Ramsey case, Burke's early behavioral incidents became more than a footnote. They became a lens through which Kohler could reevaluate timing, dynamics, and potential stressors within the household. They were echoes of a household under tension, small but telling hints that the environment was far from ordinary. Ultimately, the analysis of Burke's behavior served as a reminder that in complex cases, the most seemingly innocuous details can gain profound significance under careful scrutiny. The small acts of mischief, the episodes of distress, the behavioral anomalies, all became part of a larger narrative, a piece of the intricate mosaic that defined the Ramsey family and the environment in which tragedy unfolded. In Kohler's meticulous reconstruction, the past became more than background. It became an active element in understanding a story that had remained, for decades, shrouded in mystery. A single, seemingly childish blow, a momentary lapse, a mischievous or impulsive act, had set in motion a cascade of events no one could have anticipated. JonBenét collapsed, fragile and unprotected, her small body succumbing to force far beyond what should have caused fatal harm. What might have begun as an innocent, or at least unintentional, gesture became a tragedy, and with that tragedy came panic, confusion, and the instinct to control the narrative. In the aftermath, the parents' actions transformed the ordinary chaos of a household accident into a carefully curated performance. Rooms were staged, surfaces cleaned, objects rearranged, all in an effort to craft a story that concealed what had actually occurred. The mundane became a prop, the ordinary a tool for misdirection. Every gesture, from the positioning of JonBenét's body to the placement of items around the basement, was executed with an almost theatrical precision, as if the household itself had become a stage for a drama designed to mislead investigators and observers alike. The effort to obscure reality was meticulous. Staging, cleaning, crafting a fiction, it was all intended to present a narrative more compelling than the messy, inconvenient truth. The investigators who arrived were confronted not with a simple accident but with a scene layered with intention, calculated to shape perception. The lines between accident and crime blurred, leaving behind ambiguity that would haunt the case for decades. Psychologically, this moment underscores the profound tension between human instinct and moral reckoning. In the panic following the collapse, fear overrode transparency, and the desire to protect, to control perception, and to avoid culpability shaped the actions that would ultimately define public understanding of the night. What began as a private, tragic misstep transformed into a tableau of suspense, mystery, and misdirection. Even years later, the echoes of that panicked response resonate through the investigation. The staging, the cleaning, the effort to craft a narrative, these acts became central to understanding the broader complexities of the Ramsey case. They illustrate how quickly ordinary human reactions, compounded by fear and instinct, can transform the aftermath of an accident into a carefully orchestrated fiction, one that obscures truth and challenges even the most meticulous investigators. In that fragile, chaotic moment, the tragedy of JonBenét's collapse collided with human instinct to conceal, creating a scene that would perplex, confound, and haunt generations. The truth, small, delicate, and elusive, was hidden beneath layers of performance. a fiction so compelling that even the most objective eyes struggled to disentangle reality from the artful illusion. Almost immediately after tragedy struck, Jon and Patty Ramsey moved to protect themselves, retaining high-profile legal representation. Each parent secured separate defense teams, a calculated decision that underscored both the seriousness of the scrutiny they faced and the instinct to safeguard personal liability. Within hours, the legal machinery was in motion, shaping not only their defense but also the narrative that would reach a nation already captivated by horror and speculation. Under the guidance of their attorneys, polygraph tests were administered, but crucially, under the Ramseys' terms and control. Questions were carefully framed, conditions closely monitored, and results selectively managed. To the public, the polygraphs offered the tantalizing promise of clarity, a scientific determination of truth or deception. But in practice, these tests became another layer in a carefully constructed strategy, a means of managing perception as much as demonstrating honesty. The media seized upon every detail. Headlines blared across newspapers and television screens, "Ramsey's Pass Lie Detector." The story quickly became a dominant narrative, framing Jon and Patty as truthful, cooperative, and above suspicion. Public opinion, ever susceptible to the sway of bold headlines and simplified narratives, began to shift in their favor, even as conflicting evidence and unanswered questions lingered in the background. Investigators and forensic experts were forced to contend not only with the complexities of the case itself but also with the pressure of a court of public opinion heavily influenced by selective reporting and carefully managed messaging. This legal and media maneuvering had profound consequences. It reinforced divisions between investigative theory and public belief, making the pursuit of objective truth more difficult. Every statement, every procedural step, every publicized result was filtered through layers of strategy, influencing not only the perception of guilt or innocence but also the lens through which the entire case would be understood for years to come. The Ramseys' immediate legal response, combined with the selective dissemination of polygraph results, illustrates a chilling interplay between law, media, and human instinct. In a case already riddled with ambiguity and staged narratives, these actions serve to protect, persuade, and redirect attention. They became a critical element in a larger story where perception often outweighed evidence, and where the management of appearances could overshadow the meticulous work of investigators seeking to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of performance and misdirection. In the aftermath of tragedy, the world around the Ramseys seemed to contract and reorganize itself. Friends and extended family relocated to Atlanta, creating a protective buffer around the household. It was a subtle yet powerful shield, a network of support that appeared at first to be purely compassionate. But beneath that surface, it functioned as a layer of insulation from scrutiny. Investigators, journalists, and the public were met with an unspoken barrier. The people closest to the family had positioned themselves strategically, controlling access, shaping interactions, and limiting exposure to outside eyes. This migration was not accidental. The relocation of trusted allies served multiple functions. It offered emotional support to grieving parents, yes, but it also created a practical obstacle for anyone attempting to piece together the events of that night. Conversations could be monitored, narratives rehearsed, and outsiders kept at bay. In essence, the Ramsey household became a locus of influence, where proximity equated to protection and absence equated to distance from accountability. The wider network's role became increasingly clear under investigation. Friends and family members, once peripheral figures in the public eye, emerged as critical nodes in a protective lattice. Their presence allowed the family to maintain a degree of normalcy, or at least the appearance of it, while simultaneously controlling the flow of information. Anyone attempting to probe deeper, whether law enforcement or media, faced a subtle but formidable resistance. The people who could have offered insight had physically and psychologically repositioned themselves to shield the household. Psychologically, this network created a bubble of isolation and control. For the Ramseys, it reinforced the sense that they could navigate the aftermath with guidance and oversight, insulated from the chaos of public opinion and investigative scrutiny. For outsiders, it complicated efforts to establish timelines, verify accounts, or gain unfiltered access to witnesses. The protective network blurred the lines between loyalty, grief, and strategic manipulation, transforming acts of familial care into mechanisms of narrative control. Even decades later, this network's influence is evident. The Ramsey circle of support shaped perceptions, constrained investigation, and added yet another layer of complexity to a case already defined by misdirection, staged evidence, and conflicting narratives. It was a reminder that in high-profile tragedies, the web of human relationships can serve as both comfort and camouflage, providing emotional support while subtly shielding the truth from the world outside. James Kohler, the veteran investigator who had spent decades poring over the Ramsey case, refused to let it fade into unresolved tragedy. Driven by a relentless pursuit of clarity, he campaigned tirelessly to reconvene a grand jury, hoping to bring fresh scrutiny to evidence that had long been marginalized or dismissed. His submissions were meticulous, methodical, and damning in their implications. Among the materials he presented were the ransom note, long regarded as a bizarre artifact of misdirection. Kohler highlighted inconsistencies in handwriting, phrasing, and timing, arguing that the note's origins and intent had never been fully or objectively analyzed. The broken basement window, too, once assumed to indicate forced entry, was revisited under his lens, its status as a staged prop laid bare by forensic examination of undisturbed spiderwebs, pine needles, and the absence of footprints. Perhaps most striking were the DNA contradictions. Male DNA on JonBenét's clothing that matched neither family members nor any known criminal databases, including retests years later that revealed multiple unknown contributors. Kohler's evidence painted a landscape at odds with the original narrative. It suggested manipulation, staging, and the presence of overlooked or intentionally ignored clues. Yet despite the rigor of his submissions, his calls for renewed legal action were met with silence. Prosecutors, constrained by precedent, politics, or perhaps the inertia of an already sensationalized case, chose not to act. The grand jury never reconvened, leaving decades of questions unresolved, and Kohler's painstaking work suspended in limbo. The irony was palpable. Evidence that could have clarified timelines, challenged narratives, and brought new insight into the Ramsey household remained ignored. Each detail, the note, the window, the DNA, held the potential to unravel the carefully constructed story that had captivated the public for years. But in the absence of legal acknowledgement, the mystery endured, frozen in a state of perpetual speculation and unexamined contradiction. Kohler's struggle highlights a recurring tension in high-profile cases, the clash between investigative diligence and institutional inertia. Even the most thorough, evidence-driven efforts can be sidelined when they challenge powerful narratives or implicate influential figures. In the Ramsey case, the grand jury's inaction became another layer of frustration and intrigue, underscoring the enduring opacity of a tragedy that continues to captivate, haunt, and perplex. And so we are left with the haunting questions that have lingered for decades, the ones that refuse to be neatly resolved no matter how many investigators, forensic experts, or journalists turn their attention to Boulder, Colorado. What truly happened that night in the Ramsey home? Was it a tragic accident, a fleeting lapse that spiraled into catastrophe? Could it have been a single, unintended blow, a moment of chaos that a child could not survive, compounded by fear, panic, and instinctual efforts by terrified parents to protect themselves and their family name? Or is there still room to consider a more sinister possibility, an intruder, unseen and unrecorded, who moved silently through the house, manipulating events and leaving behind the fragments of a staged scene that has perplexed the world for decades? Each detail of that night seems to straddle the line between ordinariness and horror. The partially digested pineapple, the tiny fingerprints on a bowl, the male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing, the precision of the Maglight's fatal blow, the carefully placed ransom note, the broken basement window that could never have been an entry point, all these elements resist simple explanations. They form a puzzle where pieces fit imperfectly, where every answer raises new questions, and where certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. Justice, if it is to fulfill its promise, demands that we continue to ask, to probe, and to scrutinize, even when the truth is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or shattering. It requires that we confront the tension between perception and evidence, between what we want to believe and what forensic fact compels us to consider. It requires a willingness to examine human fear, instinct, and the sometimes catastrophic consequences of misjudgment. The staged windows, the meticulous cleaning, the placement of objects, the subtle traces of behavioral distress in the household, all point to the reality that the line between accident and deliberate act can be devastatingly thin. And yet, the human element persists in every shadow, in every overlooked fragment, in every unanswered question. The fear, confusion, and instinct to protect that night remind us of the fragility of innocence and the weight of responsibility. They remind us that even in the most ordinary households, the extraordinary can unfold, quietly, invisibly, and tragically. They remind us that truth is often hidden in plain sight, concealed not just by misdirection but by human instinct, loyalty, and love, which can cloud judgment and obscure reality. The Ramsey case remains a stark reminder that the pursuit of truth is rarely simple. The intricate web of staging, performance, misdirection, legal strategy, protective networks, and overlooked evidence illustrates how complex, human, and morally fraught investigations can be. It illustrates how fear, grief, and loyalty can intersect to create narratives that are both compelling and confounding. It demonstrates that the search for justice is not merely about resolving facts, but about understanding context, motives, and the fragile human dynamics that shape every tragedy. In the end, the questions linger because the truth is elusive, because every lead raises new doubts, and because the reality of that night may be more complex and more painful than any narrative we are willing to accept. We are compelled to keep asking, to keep revisiting evidence, to keep listening to whispers of the past and to the silent testimony of objects and traces left behind. Because sometimes, the truth is the last thing we want to hear, but it is the only thing that can honor the memory of a life lost too soon. And so the legacy of JonBenét Ramsey endures, a story of innocence shattered, of questions unanswered, of a mystery that challenges our understanding of human nature, accountability, and the delicate boundary between tragedy and culpability. It is a reminder that in the search for justice, asking the right questions, relentlessly, patiently, and courageously, is as essential as ever.